Okay, so I'm going to shift gears quite a bit and talk about my career and less about my classroom. So, so as I mentioned, I teach at Pomona College, and I've been here I just finished my 18th year. So it has been a really great institution and a great career for me. So hopefully I can, share enough with you that you want to go this route as well. Um, okay, so let's see. So what is, let me tell you a little bit about Pomona College. It's a small liberal arts college. We only have about 1,700 students, and they are all undergraduates. It has a really low acceptance rate and a large endowment. And I say that just to sort of, put on the table that there's some privilege with being at a place like Pomona in terms of students who are, they're really well prepared for the projects or for the courses that we're teaching, and additionally that I have the resources to do a lot of things. But hopefully I can share with you ideas for working with students, even maybe who don't come as prepared, or in projects that don't require any additional funding. So some things about being at a small place and at a teaching place is that I have complete autonomy over my classes. In fact, when I started, I was the only statistician in a math department. There are two of us now out of 12 or 13 faculty members. But my colleagues, my math colleagues, so I'm in a math department, my math colleagues had zero interest in anything that I was doing, which was a little bit daunting at first. But it was fantastic. I could choose every, topic, every type of course I wanted to teach, all the books, I just, nobody was telling me about to provide a final exam that every section was going to take or anything like that. I also have, access to student mentors and graders, which I find to be really helpful, both in terms of taking workload off of me, but also in particular with the mentors. I find that the more I can get the students to talk to each other, and in particular the advanced students talking to the intro students, the better the learning cycle is. Clearly, it's good for the advanced students to be talking to, to be explaining things. That's good for them. But even for the intro students, it's sometimes really incredibly helpful for them to hear the explanation from a peer instead of from me. And I do try to integrate that into my classrooms as well. I use quite a few, I use clickers a lot. So polling, which I've actually transitioned to Zoom quite easily. And when students don't give me the answer that I want them to, I have them talk to one another. I'm like, try to get your neighbor to answer. And oftentimes when they talk to one another, they can come up with the right answer. But anyway, that's my classroom, not my career. Okay, so I have smart and I have motivated students. But that also means that I have very high student contact hours. So part of being at a teaching place, whether it's liberal arts or not, it's likely that a job like mine means that you are working with students most of your hours of your week. And indeed, the vast majority of my mental energy and my time go toward pedagogy. So whether that's preparing my classes, whether it's doing research in stat ed, whether it's mentoring students about graduate school or career paths forward, that's definitely the biggest chunk of my work. Okay, so Pomona College is a liberal arts college. There are lots of them throughout the country. They don't always have only undergraduates, but it is one of the key features. Teaching is highly valued at liberal arts colleges, but that also means that oftentimes, the research that you do in pedagogy would be valued. So, doing curriculum development and kind of thinking about your teaching as a research aspect often goes hand in hand. Typically, there are much smaller class sizes and close student-faculty interaction. And then, lots of opportunities for undergraduate research. And as throughout the country in lots of different ways, we're seeing more and more emphasis on statistics and on data science programs. So if that's something you're interested in, oftentimes, there are certainly data science programs that are popping up at big universities, of course, but oftentimes liberal arts colleges have a little more flexibility in terms of starting something, a minor or a course here and there and whatnot, than a big university. So there's also teaching universities, and in in California, these are going to be, so for example, your Cal States, and they're going to be sort of all over the country, but the difference is that it's a university, which means it has graduate students, and it has sort of a research program that is a focus, but that the school itself is really has a bigger focus on the teaching side. So it's going to be really similar to a liberal arts college, but probably a little bit larger classes and a slightly heavier teaching load, but with a similar commitment to really high quality education. And then the third type of institution I'm going to talk about right now are research universities. So if you go into a profession at a research university as like a tenure track research faculty member, then you will certainly do some teaching. But that's not really what I'm talking about today. So today what I'm talking about is positions that are really kind of more teaching focused, and those certainly exist at research universities, and they're becoming sort of more and more prevalent. And to be honest, like the people I know in these positions, they're fantastic positions. So sometimes they're called professor of the practice, or they're called professor of teaching, and they're long-term permanent tenure track positions, but they're with primary responsibility in education. So maybe you would be in charge of the undergraduate curriculum. Maybe you'd be in charge of sort of the curriculum related to a new data science program, something like that. And again, the thing that makes them sort of different from the tenure track research professorship is that your work is expected to be engaging in the pedagogical mission of the university. So your professional activity and your research and your service and whatnot has to do with teaching. And certainly there would be an emphasis on excellence in teaching. Okay, so I'm just trying to put at the outset here, and also I actually am not joking about the fact that I get almost all of my teaching related materials from Alan, that I stole some of his slides. He gave a similar presentation to the previous Preparing to Teach group last year. So some of these slides are from him. So thanks, Alan. I don't know if you know that you shared with me, but you did. Okay, so just trying to set up these as like, I'm going to be talking about my experience at this liberal arts college, but that there are lots of teaching opportunities at a whole variety of institutions. So you don't have to go to a liberal arts college. Okay, so when I was in your shoes, there were two things that I was pretty nervous about. One of them was research and one was grant writing. I wasn't so nervous about the teaching aspect because I knew how to do it. There was some anxiety about being a good teacher, whether that was gonna, whether my people were gonna take my classes or want to be there and whatnot. But in terms of like being a teacher, that didn't make me nervous because there was like a textbook and I could just, prepare lectures from the material in the textbook and stuff like that. So, so the things that made me nervous were research and grant writing. And on the research question, it was, after I had finished my dissertation, it was, would I ever be able to think of an interesting question? And would I ever be able to publish in sort of good enough journals? And on the grant writing side, I was really nervous about whether or not I needed to write grants, and what if I couldn't get grants? Like, would that sort of, end my career? So with these two anxiety pieces in my mind, 20 years ago, I thought I would talk about each one in particular and about what I've done with them throughout my career. Now, Um, I'm going to talk about some real specific projects that I've worked on, in particular with respect to research. But before I get there, I'm just going to really speak to this first bullet point, which is, would I ever think of an interesting question? And it sort of goes to the response Alan gave about finding good examples and finding data. And what I think about research at this point is just keeping your eyes open, right? So just kind of asking questions like, oh, why is that? Or that seems interesting, or let's simulate that scenario. So for me, just keeping my eyes open has really been helpful in terms of continuing a research program. Okay, so so what I want to talk about now is research with undergrads, and that has really been fundamental to my research program. Again, with the idea of just keeping your eyes open and asking questions, asking good questions. When you're in a relationship with a student, with an undergraduate student, they ask questions, right? So just kind of like walking them through the process helps to think about what would be the next step. So I'm going to talk about 4 different projects and my relationship with undergraduates in these projects. So this first project is actually not my own research agenda. It's a colleague of mine, Amy Radenskaya. And she and I were curious about the behavior of the logistic map under these stochastic perturbations. And what we did for this project was we got together a group of 6 students in a semester-long, we call it a research circle. And the students earned 2 credits, which is like a half of a unit for us. And what did they do? They met weekly, or we all met, the 6 students plus Amy and I. We would meet for 2 hours a week. And then for another 2 hours, the students would meet on their own. And another 2 hours plus they would meet on their own. And I got no teaching credit for this. I just did it as a complete overload, as, you know, like almost like having a research lab. But it was 1 semester, and it was a fantastic project. So we were able to, you know, start off by talking about the logistic map and some of its properties and things we were curious about. And because there were 6 students working on the project, they would look at different aspects of it, some of it more computational, some of it more theoretical. And Marisela was able to write her entire senior thesis on it. And then a student a few years later wrote a proof sort of demonstrating all of the things that Marisela had come up with. So, so it's a way of sort of taking a step back, and this research circle is a way of kind of taking a step back from all the things you're doing and forcing yourself to think about your research project, and maybe getting a faculty colleague on board and a group of students. And by explaining to them what the research project is, you just kind of think about it once a week, and it can come together in really great ways. So a lot of my work is driven by computational just simulations, basically. So Kieran Evans is at Carnegie Mellon, and he was a preparing to teach fellow last year. So yeah. So this is a project that that came out of some work with a colleague of mine who works on molecular biology, who works on RNA-seq data, and Kieran was just thinking about how the like data were analyzed, and we started talking about the choices that went into the model. So really it's just sort of fancy t-tests, but you have to make a lot of choices, and you have to think about how to compare. This normalization piece is like how to compare apples to oranges, and it turned into this just really cool simulation study. And Kieran was able to show that, you know, depending on what assumptions you're making, it would have these sort of downstream effects. And it turned into a great paper that that has a lot of sort of thought behind it, but not any, there's no theory behind it in the sense, I mean, almost again, back to what Alan was saying, sometimes these ideas of like logic and the statistical thinking behind it is actually, you know, sort of harder and more important to, in this case, to the biological work, than proving something where the proof would have probably been asymptotic and not necessarily relevant to, you know, small sample data sets that we're working with. This summer, I'm actually working with Mine and on a project with the open intro materials. And so I have a student who is a current student and is really excited about thinking about introductory statistics and how it's taught and how it's presented. And you know, I have work for her both in terms of like almost editorial, like going through the process as a student and thinking about how a student would learn this. And then another piece of the work that she's going to be doing this summer is on, you know, Alan was talking about how we can teach students sort of randomization methods, and that he also had on the screen, you know, t-tests and whatnot, and that so often even some of the textbooks that use randomization methods to teach, they don't have that sort of parallel structure that sometimes helps students understand, you know, why would I do a t-test? Why would I do a randomization test? Are they the same? Are they different? How are they different? Like the students are just sort of learning them as tools in a toolbox, and it feels daunting. And so one of the pieces of the work we're going to do is kind of helping think about how those kind of come together. So again, this is not particularly theoretical in any big way, but I think it could be really valuable for the community, and having a student on board with this project of somebody who's sort of learning these tools and kind of thinking about them from the student perspective, and you know, how one would engage with a cheat sheet or a comparison table in that way, is going to be incredibly valuable to us providing materials that are really effective. And then one more project. So this is a similar project, or it's also with my molecular biology colleague Dan Stobel, and Madison was doing sort of more of just a data analysis project for him, and she was doing some clustering work and whatnot, and she was just right at the right place where before she started the project, she had never used ggplot, and she had never really done a ton of data wrangling, but she was able to really think carefully about communication. And sort of during the project, she ramped up her data viz skills and really thought carefully about some interesting ways to present the data in a real applied way that has helped with Dan's project in terms of the biological side, and Dan presenting his results to the biological community. So I give these as examples of, you know, 4 pretty different projects in terms of both the type of, you know, for example, the type of journals that we're going to be putting them in, or, you know, have put them in some cases, and also the type of students that are working on the methods, and the type of audience that we're expecting to read the papers. And so kind of thinking about when you go out into your, you know, your first job or whatnot, that you've for so long been thinking really carefully about your dissertation, right? And that's really important, you know, your dissertation, and making sure it gets published, and making sure that that's like, you know, a big part of your resume and you know, your job talk and all those things. But that the world of research should open up to you, and if you are at a teaching place, then you know, incorporating undergraduates into your work can be really powerful, and also, you know, a lot of fun. So the other thing that, you know, I was really scared of when I started out was about grant writing. And so why would you write grants? Well, money's nice. Money's nice, for you to be able to travel to conferences, to be able to, bring speakers in, colleagues, that type of thing. And it's really nice to fund students. Probably many of you were funded during your graduate time by faculty research grants, which can be, an incredibly valuable source of ideas for you in your research projects and in your teaching and whatnot. But not only is grant writing good for funding, it's also good for reflection. So to write a grant, you're required to talk about your research program, which means that you have to synthesize what you're doing. You have to think about, all the pieces and how they come together, and what are you going to do moving forward, and what have you already done. And that third bullet point there is actually, I think, one of the most important aspects of grant writing is just kind of keeping your research program, pulled together in such a way that you can talk about it and you can think about how to move it forward. Grants are also really nice for staying on task. If that's something that is, that maybe you need a little bit of help on, both in terms of the deadline of the grant, but also, after you get a grant, you have to write reports and whatnot. So having those publications that come from the funding. But the thing about grant writing is that it doesn't have to be the type of grant, which is that first bullet point, that you may have been funded on during your dissertation work. There's all sorts of teaching focused grants. There's student focused grants. For example, you could write a grant to host an NSF RU program, which is research experience for undergrads. So there's, lots of different ways. There's, this grant that's being funded for you to be in this preparing to teach program. You can be funded on discipline focused grants, meaning, so my colleague Dan has written me into his grants multiple times. And so, it's great for him because we have this fantastic collaboration, and it's great for me because I get funding with, without having to be the person behind, writing the entire grant. But then I put up here that, at most teaching places, you're actually not required to have grants. I am certainly not required to have grants. So as long as I'm publishing and as long as I have a productive research program, I don't have to have any grants in my portfolio. So so that's just kind of to put out there as in contrast to what is likely your experience, because most PhDs come from big R1 institutions where there's lots of grant writing, just kind of understanding that there's different positions and different institutions out there, and that, maybe not writing a grant is okay. So why would you want a job like the one I have? I mean, I love my job. It's just fantastic. I couldn't have found a better fit for me, but that's for me. So I have, like I've said, I have a tremendous amount of interaction with students. I'm able to talk to them not just about the courses and the research, but about their futures and about how statistics plays a role in lots of different aspects of society. I have, like I've said, I have, an ability to be creative in my course and the curriculum. Right now in Claremont, we're working on data science and getting that up and running. And I'm able to do lots of different types of research. But there's things to think about. So I put up this little icon under this slide because Pomona College has this 47. It's almost like our mascot, this number 47. So this it says stats, but it's like Pomona College. So you've really got to think very carefully about the institution, because despite the fact that I'm trying to say broad things about what a teaching career might be, every institution is going to be really its own place. And so when you are applying for jobs, or when you're thinking about being in a teaching place, really being careful about what it is, how many different preps would you have? Like, so if you're going to teach 3 classes in a semester, it would be great if 2 of them were the exact same class, intro stats, for example. You know, how big are your classes? Will you have graders? Will you have access to technology? You know, colleagues and collegiality, that could go for any job anywhere, but just, you know, as you're interviewing, thinking about, is this a place where there's a lot of infighting? Is this a place where I feel supported? There would be somebody here who could be my mentor, you know, all that type of thing. And then these last 2 bullet points, what's expected and what is valued, right? So what kinds of things could I put forward in terms of scholarship when I'm coming up for tenure? Does my pedagogical research count as part of my research portfolio? And I know you're thinking, this is the main thing you're thinking about, is just how do I get one of these jobs? It sounds fantastic. So, so I put up here, you know, you should have lots of teaching experience. That's really important. And you should get teaching awards. So that's clearly a little bit flippant, except for the fact that there are often opportunities that you can put yourself up for. So, you know, you should be applying for all sorts of things. And I know I'm speaking to the choir a little bit because you applied for this. And so you already know, you know, to be kind of aware of things. But some teaching awards come clearly from course evaluations, and you would have no control over that. But if there are other things from your university that you can apply for, then you should do that. And even if you're in a teaching position, being clear that you have an independent research program is also really important. So I put a couple of things, you know, of sort of additional pieces that you might not be thinking about. Obviously, you are thinking about preparing to teach as you are here, but you might have a teaching learning center that you could get involved with, and you could, you know, do outreach. I know in our breakout room, somebody was talking about how they had taught at a summer camp. So things like that, where you're just really being clear about your desire to teach and your experience teaching, and your experience working with lots of different groups. The picture on this slide is from it's from a conference called StatFest, and StatFest happens every year. I actually don't know if it's going to happen this year, given the pandemic, but the idea is for it to, students at all levels, students of color at all levels, to come together and think about statistics as a career, statistics, data science as a career, and we held a satellite version of it at Pomona in 2018. So these are all Pomona students that I'm with here. So you know, again, StatFest is something that it's like, okay, well, I could be involved in that. So when I say at all levels, it actually it does some outreach to high school students, to college students, to graduate students, postdocs, faculty members. So really coming together. And even if you're not a person of color, it's something you could get involved with and just support and really trying to understand sort of what the experience is like for all different people. Those are the types of things that that you're going to be asked about in a job interview. Okay, this is all of my, I think that's my timing. This is all of my information here. I know we're going to go to breakout room, but I'm wondering if there are any questions.
There are
Great.
some questions.
And that's what Mine says. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll read them to you. So the first one is, within a research university, what does the research expectation look like to earn tenure versus service and pedagogy? And then similarly, for a teaching university or a college, are you required to dedicate a part of your time to research?
Okay, sorry. That was too much for me, because I'm sorry. So can I Mina, I'm sorry, I'm like totally killing us here.
No.
I was gonna put, because I went to the chat and noticed that Sheridan asked this, is this the 6 recommendations? I don't, he said, can you put the slide up with the 6 recommendations?
That's from an hour ago.
Yeah, that was from earlier.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm back on you. Can you read it to me one more?
Yeah,
one more
sure,
time,
absolutely.
the question.
Within a research university, what does research expectation look like to earn tenure versus service and pedagogy? And also similarly for a teaching university or college, are you required to dedicate a part of your time to research?
So every institution is going to be different, which is, you know, why, you know, this is so important. What is your institution like? But I would say that the vast majority of positions, even ones that are just like almost purely teaching, are still expecting some type of research productivity. So when you come up for tenure, that you've done some type of publishing. In a research one institution, I think you're going to have, you know, a couple of papers a year in good journals and major grants. That's sort of going to be the expectation. At a place like Pomona College, my research expectations are one publication-ish a year, but maybe sometimes they're just in a student journal with a group of students, and sometimes they're sort of a more theoretical, you know, in a high-end journal. So the amount of productivity is much lower at a teaching place. At Pomona College, we say things like, you know, research and teaching are sort of equal, but teaching is more equal. We don't get any sort of even if you have big grants and stuff, we don't get any sort of teaching reduction. So I teach 2-2. I teach 2 classes in the fall and 2 in the spring, always, except for sabbaticals. But at a big place, you're going to find that if you get grants and whatnot, that you will be able to use that money to buy yourself out of courses. So you'll do less teaching, like maybe 1 a year or something like that. And I think the teaching load is lower at most big places as well. I'm not sure. That was a little bit rambly. I'm not sure if that was.
No. And
I feel like other people could answer that question too.
Are there any other things we want to add?
Do you want to add to that, Mina? What do you?
I think that it really does vary by institution. There are some of these teaching, tenure track teaching positions where there is an expectation of publication, but pedagogical publication. So, you know, like there are very good stat education journals, and those are perfectly fine. And some of those publications are research in the sense that you work with human subjects, you're students, and you publish about an experiment you ran. And some of them are more like case study sharing and stuff, but there is an expectation of continued publication and kind of getting your name out there, but not necessarily you have to do all of this teaching and then also have to do a certain amount of like continuing from your PhD thesis type research or something is not always an expectation. There is another question you might be able to quickly chime in, and then we have one other question after that. But you're in a math department, actually, right? So do you also teach math courses?
I don't often teach math courses. I have taught calculus in the past. Well, I teach probability, which I sort of consider a math class. I teach that pretty regularly, but that's the only math class besides once I taught Calc 2 once, which I would do again. And that's going to really depend on institution by institution as well. In the last year or so, we've talked about a third statistician, hiring a third statistician. And I have volunteered as sort of the most senior person and the person who most wants a third statistician, that I would, I'd be happy to teach a little bit of calculus here and there. So as we kind of build up the need for 3 full individuals teaching that many courses, that for a year or 2, I would be the one teaching that. So for you all, I would, you know, I would want to go to a department where you were not expected to teach. So like if we were hiring you, we would not expect you to teach math because I would teach it, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, obviously you don't always have complete control over what your next job is going to be, but ideally I think that it's not necessarily a disaster to go to a job where you're teaching math, especially if you like it, but it could be a red flag. It could be a red flag that a mathematics department doesn't understand that a statistician is sort of a fundamentally different training and different discipline.
Yeah, great. And then the last question before we break off, and others might want to chime in too, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions later. What does the collaborative environment look like at a smaller department, such as a liberal arts or teaching college or university? Is it isolating to be the only stats professor?
In some ways it is. I actually find that that the research is not particularly isolating. I've been able to do research with some of my math colleagues and you know, and students, and some of my discipline specific colleagues. I collaborate with a colleague in geology as well. But I find it a little bit isolating pedagogically, to be honest. You know, I have a colleague, but pedagogically we're not always on the same page, and that most of the people that I really look up to as some of the you know, most creative and people pushing the boundaries are not at my institution. But you know, we have the internet, right? So I go to conferences and I see these people talk. I go to workshops like this one. I follow Alan's blog. I participate in, there's something called the Isolated Statisticians website. If you just Google isostat, you'll find it. And that's sort of a listserv that people are generating ideas all the time. And if I have a question, I post something to that listserv. So if anything, I feel like I miss out on the pedagogy and just sort of the idea generation of being in a larger group of statisticians. But, you know, there's lots of ways to find that.
Let's see. So I think this is what I'm going to propose. There are a few other questions here. And instead of rushing the breakout groups, what we can do is we can finish up those questions and go to break. And then when we come back, we'll do a slightly brief breakout session to start with before Lucy goes on. So the next question is, you had in your "How do I get one of these jobs" slide, develop an independent research program bullet point. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so one of the pieces of being hired at an isolated place is that you have to drive whatever you're doing in terms of research. And that's what I mean by the independent piece. So you're not going to, you're not going to just fall into a group of topologists who are all sort of working on these, and have topology seminar once a week and whatnot. Particularly if you're like in a math department, as I am, but I would guess at most places. And so that's something that we're looking for when we're looking at a resume is, did this person purely just solve a problem that their famous advisor has, a whole slew of problems related to their advisor's work? Or is there some evidence that this person is, kind of taking that piece and owning it and looking at it in different ways, or, having reached out in different ways to, maybe you did some consulting as a graduate student, or maybe you've, again, preparing to teach is a great example, right? So you've done this workshop and you've, started generating ideas on your own about what types of classes that you would want to teach, and sort of maybe blogged about it or something like that, right? So just things that demonstrate that you have sort of this way of both idea generation, but also like networking, right? So just demonstrating that you're independent thinker and kind of using your resources for coming up with ideas.
And what strategies do you use to get students to mentor each other?
So we have specific mentoring jobs. So, I'll teach intro stats and I'll be able to hire a student, an advanced student, to literally be the tutor. So they set up once or twice a week for 2 hours, from 8 to 10 p.m. They sit in the classroom and my intro stat students go to that person. But we've also done other things, so that would be a job that would have to that we, in my case, again, the understanding that I come from an institution that has more funding for student jobs and whatnot, that's paid through department funds. But, you know, I have research students, and I have sort of senior thesis students and students in some of my advanced classes. And it's not uncommon for me to get them talking to my intro students. So, you know, I'll have an advanced student, and I'll sort of know what their background is and what classes they've taken or what experiences they've had sort of in an internship. And I'll have a you know, a more junior student come to me and say, you know, oh, I want to do X, Y, and Z. And I'll say, oh, this student did that. You should go talk to them. And I'll, you know, put them in touch through email, stuff like that. So just kind of getting to know them, you know, always asking, like every single time somebody walks into my office in the spring semester, like almost the first question I ask them is, what are you doing this summer? Which obviously this year is a little bit more complicated, but right, just like that's the first question I ask them. Hey, what are you doing this summer? You know, both as a way to get them thinking about, you know, they should be already thinking about it, even if it's only January, but also just as a way for me to get to know them.
Great.